Welcome everyone to today's Rumi Forum luncheon. We will have as our discussion the role of civil societies in building democracy and threats they face with Dr. Art Kaufman and Dr. Carlos Ponce. Art Kaufman is Senior Director of the World Movement for Democracy, a global network of activists, practitioners, scholars and others engaged in advancing democracy, which has its secretariat at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. He's responsible for planning and conducting the World Movement's global assemblies, including to date in Sao Paulo, Brazil 2000, in Durban, South Africa 2004, in Istanbul, Turkey 2006, in Kiev, Ukraine 2008, and Jakarta, Indonesia 2010. Dr. Kaufman and his staff are also responsible for helping World Movement participants develop national regional networks such as the African Democracy Forum, the Latin American and Caribbean Network for Democracy, and the World Forum for Democratization in Asia, and functional networks focused on democracy, research, local governments, youth engagement and women's political participation, among others. Dr. Carlos Ponce is the General Coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean Network for Democracy, a network of over 210 leading civil society organizations across the Americas, which is affiliated with the World Movement for Democracy, an expert on human rights, civil society and democracy in Latin America. He's a member of the World Movement Steering Committee and the lecturer at Tufts University. In his native Venezuela, Dr. Ponce successfully founded and led the Justice and Development Consortium, a non-governmental organization that develops justice reform and conflict resolution programs at the local level and advise the student movement in the country. I welcome both of them today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. And I'll leave it to Art to begin.
Okay. First, I'd like to express my thanks to the Rumi Forum for arranging our presentations today and our discussion, and especially to Emre and also to Jenna for all their assistance. I want to begin, what I'd like to do is provide a kind of overview of the origin and background of the World Movement for Democracy, because I think it can serve to be instructive about the challenges that civil society faces in bringing about democracy, and provide some information about the background to a project that we've launched called Defending Civil Society. And this overview will then be followed by a presentation by Carlos Ponce, which will specifically address the issues in the Latin American Caribbean region, and even more specifically in his home country of Venezuela. So let me begin just very generally about the founding of the World Movement. It was launched as an initiative by the National Endowment for Democracy in 1999 with a global assembly in New Delhi, India. We brought together a number of grantees of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is mainly a grant-making organization, for a series of sessions and discussions about challenges to democracy, work that needs to be done on women's political participation, on youth engagement, on using new technologies, other areas of work that democracy activists are engaged in. And it was a very good conference and series of discussions, but in the last session there was a protracted discussion about whether there was sufficient need and interest around the world to create a global network that would keep these discussions and exchanges going. And the participants in that discussion did in fact launch the World Movement for Democracy and adopted a founding statement. The interesting thing in a way was the discussion about what to call the new network. Some people wanted to call it a World Alliance for Democracy, and other people said, well, it's not quite an alliance yet, so let's not be so presumptive. And other people wanted to call it a World Forum for Democracy, and other people said, well, we should have something that's more than just talk. So they settled on the World Movement for Democracy, which is more than just talk. But that might ostensibly also lead eventually to a World Alliance for Democracy. So that's where we are right now. We're the World Movement for Democracy. I think what's interesting is if I would just quickly run through the list of, from the founding statement, the list of those who were intended to be included in the World Movement for Democracy, because I think it gives you a very good sense of what we mean by civil society and what we mean by the work of civil society on democracy. So the World Movement was intended to include political party representatives who are seeking reform and renewal of political parties and party systems, leaders of NGOs and other professionals working to improve human rights, institutionalize transparency and accountability, modernize legal systems, strengthen representative institutions, enhance the status of women in politics, society, and the economy, incorporate other excluded groups, promote civic education, and otherwise reform and invigorate democracy. Trade unionists who are committed to giving workers a democratic voice in a rapidly changing global economy. Business leaders committed to democracy, economic competition, and accountable and transparent corporate governance. Leaders of policy research institutes and other scholars who are studying conditions for democracy and advancing concrete initiatives. Civic and other educators who are working both within and outside the formal school systems to develop in their fellow citizens the values, skills, and knowledge that undergird a free and participatory society. Religious leaders who are working for the freedom of conscience and the freedom to worship of all peoples and faiths. Representatives of international democracy foundations that provide financial and technical assistance to pro-democracy groups in transitional and authoritarian countries. And finally, independent journalists, broadcasters, and other specialists in communications who can help pro-democracy groups utilize new information technologies as tools for democracy building. This gives you a sense of the breadth of work, in a sense, that's being done by civil society in various countries around the world. All these various sectors have goals to achieve in democratization. Following this inaugural assembly that launched the World Movement, we drew together a steering committee, an international steering committee. Carlos is a member. They are people who have achieved significant accomplishments in democracy promotion in their own countries and have very good horizon views of the challenges within their regions. And the steering committee then asked NED to continue to serve as a secretariat for the World Movement, which it does currently, in part because it was our initiative, but also very much in part because we have a Democracy Resource Center which is able to provide intellectual resources, guidebooks, various other products of groups that work on democracy in their countries so that these can be shared. NED serves as a secretariat. And in the founding statement, there was a call for the World Movement to reconvene roughly once every 2 years in a different global region. And as Emery pointed out, we have subsequently held global assemblies in almost every region of the world now, and now we're looking forward to organizing our next global assembly, which will come towards the end of 2012. As a result of the global assemblies and the work of the Secretariat at NED, we have also helped develop regional and functional networks within the World Movement. Carlos, as you've heard, is the general coordinator of the Latin America and Caribbean Network for Democracy. There's also an African Democracy Forum. There's also an Asian network called the World Forum for Democratization in Asia. We also do other networking without formal networks, for instance, in Eurasia and Central Eastern Europe and other places. So these are ways really to meet the general mission of the World Movement, which is to provide a way for democracy activists, practitioners, and others involved in advancing democracy to teach and learn from each other, to share strategies, to learn what works or doesn't work in given contexts. And so in a certain sense, it leverages the investment that democracy support organizations provide to civil society organizations working for democracy. So they get funds to carry out their work, but their work will be that much better if they can actually compare notes with other organizations doing similar work in other countries and regions. We have now identified three main pillars, in a certain sense, of the World Movement's focus. One is youth engagement and participation, and I think anyone who has been reading the papers lately knows how important youth movements can be to bringing about democratic transitions, or at least in initiating them. But Carla certainly can tell you about the ways in which youth and students contribute to movements for democracy in various countries, and certainly, for example, in Venezuela. A second pillar is called How to Build a Democracy Movement. And we don't mean the global democracy movement, we mean democracy movements in particular countries, in individual countries. And that includes, for instance, how to use new technologies, how to develop strategic partnerships, how to interact with the media, how to reach out and educate the general, broader public about democracy and how it will affect them, and why they should support it. And then the third pillar is defending civil society. And our focus today is mainly on this defending civil society aspect of our work. So what I want to do first is talk a little bit in general terms about what civil society organizations do and can do to advance democracy. And then I want to talk a little bit about what the threat is now to that work. So the first thing is civil society helps prepare a country for a transition to democracy, for instance, by providing or encouraging civic education about democracy and human rights. Education is an absolutely essential function. But they also do the following things. They advocate for freedom in various sectors, such as independent media, political party organization, free and fair elections, judicial independence, women's political participation, economic reforms, the list goes on. In many countries, there's an organization or several organizations for almost every kind of sector in the society working for democracy. But above all, perhaps, building solidarity within the society around democratic values. This is the basis upon which democracy movements emerge. When people, and I think it's sort of interesting to recognize, we often ask people, participants in the world movement, how did you become a democracy activist? And we always get different answers. The one answer I got, which really sort of was illuminating for me, was when we were organizing our assembly in Brazil, and someone said, well, they were planning to build a garbage dump right down the block from us, or down the street, down the road, and we really, became very upset about this, and we went to the local authorities and we said, and by the way, this is not in Brazil, it's another country, but we went to the local authorities and we said, we want to question this, we want to, and they basically looked at him and said, who are you? You have no say, this has already been decided. And that was the end of it, and they showed him the door. And they got together after and they said, why can't they listen to? Why don't we have an input? Why don't we? And so they started out with a very simple thing happening in their town and ended up as democracy activists, because they understood that if it can happen on that issue, it can happen on any number of other issues. I think the same thing is true with environmental activism sometimes. Where people can begin with an interest in the environment and threats to the environment, and they realize that they need a channel, they need input, they need a way to influence their government, and they don't have it. So they become democracy activists. Civil society organizations also help in the transitions themselves, in the consolidation, through many of these same activities. Advocacy, education, building solidarity, all those kinds of activities. So in a word, if a transition to democracy is really about self-government, then clearly civil society should be engaged and active in providing its advice and recommendations about reforms, constitutional provisions, institution building, protections of rights, and other aspects of transition and consolidation. That makes for an effective transition. So their involvement is absolutely essential. Now, as we all know, totalitarian and authoritarian governments have for many years taken measures to preserve their power by suppressing efforts to bring about change. Intimidation, arrests, imprisonment, torture, and execution are all too familiar. But there's been this new threat that has emerged in recent years. And this new threat presents a whole new challenge. An increasing number of governments have been implementing new NGO laws, NGO standing for non-governmental organizations, new NGO laws and other measures to close down civil society space, especially for those working on democracy and human rights. There's evidence that governments have been sharing their laws or measures with each other, sharing information about each other's dissidents, and generally working together in an effort to restrict civil society work. In fact, I have come to the conclusion that if there is a world movement for democracy, there is also now a world movement against democracy, and it may very well be winning. At least that was the conclusion I had come to before everything started happening in the Middle East, which gave me a little bit of hope that we might reverse the tide. But that's all to be seen. So right now I'm still fairly well persuaded that we are up against a very formidable challenge. As a result of this challenge, the World Movement Steering Committee launched this project called Defending Civil Society in late 2007, and the World Movement partnered with the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, which is one of the foremost organizations with legal expertise, on the legal environments for civil society. So they're the actual legal experts on what the conditions are for civil society to function. And so following a number of regional consultations and discussions with democracy activists and practitioners around the world, the World Movement and ICNL published this report, which we're circulating, called Defending Civil Society, which does two things. The first thing it does is it articulates the principles that ought to inform proper government-civil society relations in a healthy democracy. So, for example, the right to organize, the right to advocate and free expression, and, including a number of others, the right to receive support, finances from outside the country. And obviously this is extremely crucial in countries where there is no way to raise money inside the country for democracy and human rights work. And so the only way that these organizations continue to function is by accessing funds from abroad. And so one of the easiest ways, I suppose, for a government to suppress civil society is to cut off that funding, which many of these governments have effectively done. So working with ICNL, the World Movement has subsequently organized numerous regional, sub-regional, and national fora, bringing together civil society organization representatives and legal experts to raise awareness of the challenge, to share ideas for addressing it, and on the country level, to formulate national strategic plans. And I should add a word about different contexts. Because in some cases, civil society is able to engage with government, and we, through this project, help facilitate that. So the government is amenable to sitting down with civil society and hearing the complaints and hearing the suggestions for reform. And, in some cases, they've actually gone ahead and made changes. So there have been instances of success. In some countries, the government is writing new laws, especially a new democratic government may be writing new laws for legitimate objectives, transparency, to make sure they can track the flow of fund money in and out of the country. I mean, there are legitimate ends for some of these laws. The problem is that the way they get written have the same pernicious effects as if they were written specifically to constrain civil society. So what we've been able to do, and ICNL especially has been able to do, is to actually sit down with the government and consult to them on, okay, here's your objective, here's a better way to write the law so that it doesn't have those pernicious effects. And so there are these different contexts. I just want to say three more things as a result of the project. One is that the World Movement and ICNL are now participating with other international initiatives, non-governmental, and with governments, including the chair, which is the Government of Canada, in a working group on enabling and protecting civil society of the community of democracies, which is a different initiative. It's an intergovernmental initiative on the ministerial level This coming summer, they will meet in Vilnius, Lithuania, since they're now the chair of the Community of Democracies. The ministers will come. Secretary of State Clinton is planning to be there. And they invite governments to come and discuss challenges to democracy, what democratic governments can do to address those challenges. There are various working groups, including this one on enabling and protecting civil society. And within this working group, we've taken on a number of activities. We've developed an international contact group of individuals within governments and in intergovernmental bodies. And we're able to send alerts to this contact group when certain laws that are destructive of civil society rights are being tabled in Parliament and considered, or other decrees or measures are being issued by governments that have a pernicious effect on civil society. We can contact this international contact group, which then, through mainly diplomatic means, can bring some pressure to bear, or try to bring some pressure to bear on those countries to roll back or to prevent the passage of these bad laws. So that's one of the activities we're doing. And one of the other things that's come out of this working group was a push, and now apparently a very successful push, for the UN to create a special rapporteur on freedom of association. And my understanding is that a recommendation of an appointment has been made, and the Human Rights Council is expected to approve that, and there should be an announcement shortly. And we think that this provides a whole new way for these issues to be brought to the general public, but certainly to those in the UN community and in the international community, and begin to think about ways to respond to them and to defend the freedom of association wherever it's under attack. The other thing I would mention is the U.S. State Department has just launched a strategic dialogue with civil society and is encouraging other democratic governments around the world to do the same thing. This is very important, and this will be my last remark. I think this is very important because we have to recognize that there are especially new emerging democracies in different regions around the world that can have very good influence on encouraging democracy within their regions. South Korea, South Africa, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia. These are countries that are now very well respected as democracies. They have growing economies. They have larger influences within their region, but they're not doing enough to advance democracy in their regions. And these kinds of strategic dialogues with civil society, particularly with people in those countries, can help advance that effort. And the World Movement is also working on that. So all of that as a kind of background and some description of what we see as being the main issue right now for the World Movement for Democracy, for sure, and the ways in which we're trying to address those challenges. And so what I think would be useful right now is for Carlos to pick up on that and talk a little bit about the challenge within the Latin American Caribbean region, and more specifically in Venezuela.
We're doing good. You can continue. Well, I'm really honored to be here, and as Art said, I'm part of this wonderful experience to be part of the World Movement for Democracy. Give you the opportunity to exchange views, to dialogue with other people, and sometimes to share experience and to know that you are not different than the rest of the activists worldwide. That the problem that you face in some of our countries in Latin America is the same problem that sometimes African countries face, and African NGOs or civil society organizations have to deal with. And sometimes that gives you an opportunity also to exchange ideas. And now with 2.0 technologies, it's easier than before. And sometimes you can see that an uprising in other country can lead to other kind of activities in another country. So it's a good opportunity to be part of this networking kind of activity. That's why I got involved in the creation of this Latin American Caribbean network. That was really hard because Latinos, we tend to be really dispersed sometimes, and but for almost 3 years we have been working together in a positive network to exchange ideas, to come with new proposals at the regional level to protect each other. Sometimes sending an email 50, 100 times each organization to their contacts. It's 247 organizations in the network, plus another networks inside our network. At the end, it's 50,000, 100,000 emails to direct contacts. So it's a major effect. Sometimes people listen. People do listen. And that's a good opportunity. That's what I got involved with this network. It's a network of democracy. Then you can find people from the left, from the right, from the center, democratic anarchists, whatever's in the map. Everybody's getting together. And sometimes dialogue is very difficult when you have people with different mind frames. But we always try to dialogue, and I think that's the main goal of this forum here. And I think this is a positive thing. I agree that worldwide we experience some kind of backlash in terms of democracy and in terms of freedom of association and in terms of human rights. In one hand, some traditional authoritarians, I think they're falling apart, those authoritarians right now, but traditional authoritarians there. Then there's the elected authoritarians in some countries who took advantage of inequalities, who took advantage of the situation of some countries to take control of the country, to take control of the mind of the people, and to begin to control of the institutions. And on the other hand, you have some stable democracy. They had terrible problems in the past that faced terrible military authoritarian regimes, and they became a progressive democracy with respect to human rights, with respect to democracy. But what they export is authoritarians. When they go to another country, for example, Brazil, when Brazil goes to Cuba, when somebody's dying in a hunger strike, fighting for his right, and the president of Brazil, a former president of Brazil, just decided to take a picture with the autocrats in Brazil, autocrats in Cuba, or when they support the regime of Hugo Chavez, who has been in power for 11 years, changing the constitution, changing the law, and applying his own rule of law. Right now, his Congress is the judiciary, he's ruling by decree, all the institutions in his own hand. Or when he supports, for example, Nicaragua's Ortega, or you name it, or Gaddafi. This is the other piece of this equation. So I will be really happy to say, well, look, we have been showing some progress in some countries like Brazil, or some countries like Panama, or some countries like Chile, or even El Salvador in my region. But if we apply this formula, I'm not happy with that. Because if you apply democracy for your own sake, you have to explore also that democracy. You have to promote that. And to be honest, to be the active promoter of Odebrecht in Brazil, the major industry in Brazil, in Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and those countries, using your power for that, is not a healthy thing. The reality in the majority of the country in Latin America, it's my region, it's where I work, was not good. It's not good before when you review the situation in Latin America. And some few years ago, you see in Guatemala, 250,000 people die in internal conflict, guerrillas movement in several places, inequality everywhere, unbalanced situation everywhere, really rich people, only 1-2% of the wealth in the hands of this 1-2% of the wealth, and the rest really poor, without basic service, without any kind of access to anything. People without access to even an ID to know that they are part of that country. And that's the situation of Bolivia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Venezuela, you name it. And also people with faith in democracy, because Latin America came from a past of military regime, and then we had the promise of new democracies, invigorated democracies in the region. So from almost 90% of the region with military regimes to right now 98% of the region, except for Cuba, we can say that we have electoral democracies in all the rest of the country. Electoral democracies because this has been an authoritarian elected presidents in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. But they are elected. They were elected. They try to behave like elected one. The situation was not good. But at least several years ago, I've been doing this, I don't know how many years now. But several years ago, we had an opportunity to work. We had an opportunity to build dialogue inside the community, to work for some people to improve the situation of the country, to work for the rule of law, to improve the justice system. In my case, improve the justice system, working with community leaders to improve their skills so they can become more active in terms of control, in terms of monitoring institutions. That kind of activity, we were allowed to do that kind of thing. We were allowed to express ourselves, to use any kind of media, any kind of way to express ourselves. Of course, the media has always been controlled by powerful groups, but at least we had an opportunity. When this regime came in my country 11, 12 years ago, everybody was expecting a change, of course. Tired of years of ineffective democracy or unbalanced situation in the country, they decided to vote for a guy who came from the military who tried to coup d'etat. But that day, it was a sad situation for the country. But even at that time, we had some opportunities to work because the government decided to create its own transition inside the authoritarian regime. The government offers several people to get on board from the civil society, to get on board of the government, and then began to just throw these people away because they tried to think inside the structure of the government and trying to repropose something inside the structure of the government. For an authoritarian guy who thinks that he is the only one who has all the answers for everything, that's a terrible thing. That's a terrible thing. You have to get rid of these people. And also, we began to experience some changes. From changing some legislation to try to avoid any opportunity for people to think, to express themselves, laws that controls the media, and persecution to journalists, laws that controls civil society, and persecution to leaders of civil society. I spent 2 years and a half without a passport because the government decided there was a challenge to have somebody like me traveling around the world talking about democracy. We have a law right now that if you receive international, or even if not, if you receive any kind of funding and somebody comes to the country invited by you and say something, whatever, against the government or whatever that the government thinks is against the government, they're going to shut down your organization and they're going to impose a fine. And the fine is going to be the double of the money that you received that year. So you can imagine that operate under that circumstances. And we have been facing persecution. They have been treating us with jail. And the use of the justice system against civil society organizations, persecution for the groups that are supporters of the government. And the problem with this is that this situation is not only in Venezuela. You see the same situation in Nicaragua. Elected Ortega, and he changed the law, not even the constitution. He interpreted the law. He asked some of his friends to interpret the law so he can be re-elected forever. And when you use the power of the state and you use that in your own benefit, you can do that for a while. It's the same situation of Ecuador. It's in the same situation of Bolivia. Bolivia is quite a bit different because in Bolivia, an elite was ruling the country for an indigenous country for too many years, so long. But right now you have also a minority inside this majority of indigenous group ruling the country. But Bolivia needs an upraise of the huge majority and begins to rule their own destiny. But it's the same situation in all of this country. Somebody decided by us Somebody decided what is our best alternative in the country. But it's something that you can compare. When you begin to compare the laws or the action, because it's not only the law, it's also all the activities, all the persecution, all the restrictions that the government imposed to independent media, to civil society organizations, freedom of religion. You have persecution in some of this country. You have persecutions to any other way of thinking in countries like Venezuela or countries like Ecuador, or Bolivia, or Nicaragua. When you have this in your hand, no matter what you do, looks like something awful in those countries, because you try to promote democracy. You can't promote democracy in those countries. So what is the alternative sometimes? Networking. Sometimes also begin to work and empower people. Begin to empower people so they can begin to promote changes. Like 7, 8 years ago, it was by a coincidence. I never tried that on purpose. I was lecturing in Mérida State in the countryside. So like 8 hours from Caracas by the land, 10 hours. And then some youth activists from Mérida came to me and told me, well, we have been working a movement here, we are tired of this government. And by the way, there are people, because one of the particular thing right now in Latin America, they have a crazy dialectic about leftists and how the left is a powerful force right now, the socialists of the 21st century, all of that. The majority of respectful people from the left in Latin America is not thinking that way, but this is another story. In this case, these kids from a movement that's center left inside the university told me that they were ready to begin some kind of activity there, and I began to prove them. Well, they tried to see if they were really motivated, and asked them, well, you know, I wake up at 5 a.m. If you come to my hotel at 5 a.m., we can talk. They went there. And then I told them, well, I can find for support. Let me help you to organize yourself. And they began to organize themselves. I got a small grant from NED. I helped them to get the small grant. It was really hard to present that project to NED at that time, to NED, because a project for some kids in a university in Venezuela, come on. But at that time, the one who runs the Latin American program was a good friend of mine. And with $4,000, what we provide for was an opportunity for this kid to organize themselves and also to begin to travel around the country to identify, to see where were the leaders in each one of the universities. And always, when there is something like this happening in a country, and you have a possibility or an action that unchain all the rest of the things there, we had this group working, and then the government decided to close one of the major TV channels. So this group was already working, and the government does this, and they were not at the beginning fighting for democracy. The student movement were trying to organize themselves just as a movement. And they decided to take that challenge and begin to talk about freedom, about democracy, and that was the really big major change in Venezuela. The student movement has been there for a while, monitoring election, supervising the regime. Right now they are in a hunger strike. When nobody's doing anything, there are 50 kids in hunger strike for the last 3 weeks, and maybe nobody cares, but I care, and there are people that cares. But because of Venezuela as an oil country, we don't want to mess with that. We don't want to mess with the oil country because, well, oil prices, you know, we have to be aware that messing with Chavez is probably going to have a problem with the oil market, and let's leave these people alone. But you have an opportunity there. You have an opportunity with the kids. What we are trying to do right now is to bring the experience from Venezuela to Nicaragua, for example. And I went to Nicaragua and had a meeting, the same meeting that I had 8, 9 years ago. Told them, well, if you want to meet with me, my time is 1 a.m. because I have meetings the whole day. And they came. It's the same with Guatemala. They came. So I see there's something there. It has been inspired by the movements in Egypt, in Tunisia. It has been really inspired by us. And they want to do something. They want to work. They want to acquire knowledge. They want to use technology. They want to use Facebook. They want to use texting. By texting, you have a major tool there. And it was hard for me to understand this several years ago. But then, in one of the monitoring activities in Venezuela, so one of the kids telling me, you know what? With this structure that you help us to put together, I'm texting right now to 2.5 million persons at the same time. It's nothing compared with that. Nothing compares with that. So we have a tool. We have youth. We have technology. The opportunity is there to put all the things together and try to help them to really make a change, to really change the situation. Because people like me, I don't want the same situation that we had before Chavez. I don't want that. I was working in this before that. If I was working in Venezuela in the civil society before Chavez, it's because the situation was not perfect and needs some changes. And it's the same case of some organization in Bolivia. They don't want the same thing. They want changes, but real changes. If we're going to have a revolution, it's going to be a big, major revolution where the people really take control of the activity, that really take control of the power, and really we have a actual democracy in our country, respect of human rights, real rule of law, not the kind of rule of law that we have right now. And freedom, fundamental freedoms. Lack of fundamental freedom we experience right now. So we have an opportunity. We have comparative, in terms of situation, we can compare some of the uprising in some of the countries with the situation that happened in Venezuela several years ago. We don't know it's going to happen again. Probably. There are some people working, still working. There's some people working in Nicaragua. There's some people working in Bolivia. There's some people working in Ecuador. And we don't know what's going to be the time. The time will come. We're not in a hurry. When you have been working in civil society for 20-something years, of course you're not in a hurry. To end this, I had a rough meeting with one of the ministry of Chavez one day. And what I told him is, you have been, by that time, he was a friend of mine years ago. And I told him, well, we were friends, but you know what? By the time you have to leave the power by force, because democracy will come, you're going to ask me to defend you. And I'm going to tell you yes, because that's my job. But the other thing is, even if you get rid of me, you're going to find somebody like me doing the same kind of thing that I have been doing. And I have been doing this for the last 25 years. You can imagine how stubborn is a guy who has been doing this for 25 years and keep going and going. It's really hard to change that. But in your case, as soon as you use the wrong words with the president, you're going to be out, and you're going to be persecuted, and you're going to ask for support from me, because that happened before. And that's how it works. That's the difference of the kind of power we can manage. And that's the difference of the opportunity that we have.
Thank you. If I may, I'll start with one question, then I'll take it to the audience. Of course, the hot topic is the Middle East, and each one of those countries or groups of people are at different levels currently. Some are gotten rid of their leaders, some are in the process, there's protests, etc. What is the process? I mean, what now for those that have moved in to a new phase like Tunisia and Egypt, and for others that are given hope, whether it be other countries in the Middle East or elsewhere? What's the next step for those in terms of developing a fully fledged democracy? I mean, how long is the process? What is their hope of achieving that?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, so I can't give you any definitive answers. My impression is that developments will be different in each of these countries because the situations were different in each of them, and I think the geopolitics and economic politics are going to have different influences in different countries, because large countries with a lot of influence have different interests in each of these countries in the Middle East, less in some and more in others. And so they're going to be less or more willing to do certain things to support civic movements or democracy movements in any given one of them. My general sense and feeling is that civil society involvement, again, is essential. And I think one of the interesting things which we've always noticed over the years is that it's extraordinarily helpful, I think, for people in governments, in new democratic governments, who were once in opposition movements, to participate in discussions with people who are now moving into new governments in these countries and tell them what it means to move from opposition into governance. Because you can't govern as an oppositionist. And if all you have ever known is being an opposition to the government, it really does, it's a complete change of culture or mindset to begin thinking about governance. And so that's one thing. I think there needs to be a lot of assistance in that way of bringing people with experience, people who have been through these kinds of transitions, into discussions with people who are now joining new governments, and obviously we're very hopeful that they will be democratic ones. So I think that's an essential thing. I think any assistance that organizations around the world, and there are many of them, definitely not too many, can give in terms of institution building. People from think tanks, people from support organizations, donor organizations, from governments themselves, can really talk about institutions, which are the ones you really need to get going first, sequences, these kinds of things. And, so this kind of assistance has to be brought to bear. And, I think there is going to be a challenge. Well, there are a lot of challenges, but there will be a challenge, I think, where people, at least in some of these countries, where there have been people who have been involved in the opposition, going into government, and leaving the opposition organizations kind of headless, which becomes a challenge within civil society, because you've gotten, okay, well, these are the best people from the opposition, so we need to get them into the government. Well, who takes over on the civil society side? How deep, is the old story about sports teams. How deep can you go in the lineup, to get good quality people? And I think that's also a challenge on the civil society side of who's going to head up these organizations after people go into the government. So that's a challenge, and I think there has to be investment. I think governments, non-governmental foundations, people have to start investing, because really we're at a very early beginning point in the best of the situations. In the very best of the situations, we're at a very early beginning point. And any number of ways these things can run off the tracks from becoming democracies. And so that's my general sense of it. I would say that my expectation is that in some of these countries there is not going to be a transition to democracy as we would want to see it. That doesn't mean that the regimes that do form won't be better than the ones they replaced. In other words, they might be more open to dialogue with civil society. They might be willing, for instance, to relax national security laws. They might be willing to professionalize police forces, or any number of things that help, at least, to make them more decent governments without necessarily becoming democratic governments, at least early on. And so I think there's some hope for that right now in the region. But I think, I mean, it's something that Carlos, I think, touched on is, every time we do our global assemblies in a different region, in a different country, and inevitably I have some interaction with the press of that country. And I always make a point of saying that the people of that new democracy, because we always do these assemblies in relatively new democracies, and I always say that when the people of a new democracy stand up for Democrats working for change in other countries, it reflects back on their own commitment to democracy at home and helps deepen and consolidate their own democracy. Because when people see that, when they see fellow citizens saying, yes, democracy for the Burmese, democracy for the Venezuelans, democracy for the Tibetans, and you have people standing up within your own country, you say, wow, these people are really committed to democracy, and they must be committed to it here. And so I think that helps spread the message in a way, and I think it's extraordinarily important.
Do you want to add to that, Carlos?
Yeah, well, I think in some practical terms, so when you go to a poor community and try to provide a workshop or a training with them about democracy or some tools to improve democracy or judiciary or any of human rights. And sometimes the donors, it's hard for the donors to understand why there was restriction. You just go ahead and go and talk and that's it. Because people need to have something in their stomach to begin to understand what do you try to say. You have to respect their rights sometimes. And sometimes you need delivery democracy in all these countries. In the experience of my region, the countries that have been succeeding, they have been a success story in terms of democratic stability, has been the countries who has been implementing also some social agendas. Respect to the rule of law, respect to the institutions, respect of the market, respect of the investment, but also respect to the people. Implementing social agendas that goes together with markets and goes together with investment and try to create some space for the people to have something there. Bolsa Familia in Brazil, for example. One of the things that maybe yes or maybe not made the current president win is when the people began to think that probably they will lose the Bolsa Familia. That's something that is not for them. The Bolsa Familia pays $50 per month to poor families only if they keep their sons or daughters in school. If their kids keep their kids in school and go to regular medical checkup, the kids, you cannot obtain the $50 per kid. What is really good? Because what you invest is in the future of Brazil. At the same time, the president, non-educated president, deciding to invest in new college, technical institutions, so these kids, as soon as they graduate from school, they're going to have some places to go. And you see Brazil, from 1,300% of inflation to a stable country right now. It's the same case of Peru, or it's the same case that Funes in El Salvador that has been improving the situation. It's investing in the people, it's trying to change the situation. And for the donors, it's not forgetting about the organization that remains there. The organization that needs new leadership, that needs support, because it's also implementing some plans that will help some organization to maintain some kind of accountability in the new government, and to be a stronger voices in their countries. Because sometimes some donors forget about the organization as soon as they begin to work with rule of law, implementing the institution, changing this, changing that, the legislature. Well, let's change the government, let's improve all the institutions. And they forget about the leaders, about the people who need support to be a major force of change. And maybe that's some of the recipes for that.
Thank you. I'd like to open up to questions. Please stand, state your name and affiliation if you like. At the back, sir.
My name is David Kaufman, and I have a question for Carlos Ponce. Of course, you're from Venezuela, and you're pretty critical of the current government there. I'm no apologist for Chavismo. I'm actually a journalist, so I understand that free press in Venezuela may indeed have been under siege because of the actions of the regime. But my question goes to recent history. Early in the past decade, I think the year might have been 2002. I'm referring to the attempted coup, organized in part through the intervention of the U.S. intelligence and military agencies that assisted certain sectors within Venezuela, in the business community, the capitalist elites, if you will, in an attempt, briefly successful, over a 3 or 4 day period, successful in ousting the government. Of course, it did return. My question is this: does that incident, an attempt to overthrow democracy by U.S. government with the collaboration actively of some sectors of Venezuelan society, does that in any way give exculpatory rationale for the current government?
Well, it's a good question. That was 12 years ago. So everything that deals with the government of Chavez deals with ancient history, deals with former communist ideology that not a single country except Venezuela tried to implement. All of the things deals with past, of course. I'm not from the elite, but the elite still ruling Venezuela. The same elite that have been ruling Venezuela for the last 40 years are the same elite that are ruling Venezuela with Chavez. It's not a major change. The 72% of poor people in Venezuela, now it's 76, 77%. Now they have some possibility to access to another service. I think that 5 years ago was better that the access to services, but that has been going down as soon as Chavez has begun to intervene in Nicaragua or Bolivia. But the media has been controlling, the private media has been controlling all the airways in Venezuela for a long time. But you don't have the right to close, even Radio Caracas Televisión, the TV station that Chavez closed. I hate that TV station. It was really bad. For me, it was poor, and just keeping the people's mind with this soap opera all day, that was not a good thing. But even that, even though that the owner of the TV station, we had a really nasty relation because I don't respect him. Even with that, I was the first one to help when they shut down that TV station, because you cannot use that tools to close independent media. Yes, it was a coup d'etat. I was one of the first to call and write to all ambassadors there, to call everybody, alerting about the coup d'etat. And if you research, the first one who began to write to the U.S. and everywhere, and is in the National Inquiry and everything, everywhere, was me, because it was the same thing than Chavez. Doesn't mean that Chavez was good. No, this was worse than Chavez, if it was possible. So it's not a matter of can Chavez improve it, or no, Chavez continued to be. Chavez has a major plan. It has been implemented his plan for the last 11 years. He had a great opportunity to be like Lula, a great opportunity to be like Lula, a great opportunity to be like Bachelet, or to be like Tabaré Vázquez, or to be like the president of El Salvador, to balance the situation, to improve the situation of the people, to work for the people. No, he decided to repress, he decided to persecute the people, he decided to persecute people from the left, people from the right, people from everywhere. It doesn't matter if you are left or right, you gotta be persecuted. No, it doesn't matter if you have money. You're gonna be in without the passport for 2 years and a half, or in jail. So it has to deal with autocrats, and that's what I think.
I had a question at the...
Good afternoon. My name is Mujahid Biar. I'm from Masjid Muhammad. The question that I have is how do the World Movement for Democracy, is there a way of measuring the practice of democracy in a country? For instance, here in America, there is some anti-democratic movements. So is there a way of measuring the practice and maybe rating a country?
There are. The World Movement doesn't do it specifically. Freedom House does its annual Freedom in the World survey, and you can consult this. I think it's probably online. And they have a formula, methodology of actually looking at each country and making a determination of where it falls in terms of its status as a democracy, and particularly on human rights issues, and whether it's moved up or down. So that can be tracked, at least according to Freedom House methodology. Another one, for instance, is Civicus, which is based in South Africa, which has a civil society index, which is actually a very interesting one because the reports for the index actually come from the people affiliated with Civicus in the country itself. So it's not like outside researchers go there and do an analysis and come back and report it. They actually receive the reports from people living in those countries, and they can report on, you know, the level of freedoms and democratic institutions and rollbacks and all that sort of thing. So there are these. There's also the Latino American Barometer. There's an Afro Democracy Barometer that you can also consult, which are done by think tanks. And they do that kind of tracking of democratization in countries within their regions. I think, in a way, the larger kind of question or observation on this is kind of interesting because, again, you know, when we do these global assemblies in these countries, I'm almost inevitably asked the question, what do you mean by democracy? And, you know, my response is to say, look, as I said earlier, you know, what we're about is organizing people, building solidarity around democratic values. And there are, and I think we have to be committed to this, there are universal values. The question is how they get applied in particular circumstances, where you have different cultures, you have different histories, you have different population composition, all kinds of issues play into it. So, for example, as a constitutionalist, and we did this actually at a former position I was in. We actually did a conference bringing together surviving Constitution writers to talk about their experience of writing a Constitution. And we asked them to take all these different kinds of things into consideration. What did you do about the ethnic diversity of your country? What did you do about Sharia law? What did you do about these kinds of things? And we had a very interesting array of countries, and they wrote these essays about how they had to take all these different things into account. But what was interesting was to see how much they held in common in terms of the values. And I don't think it's out of place to say here that what I'm also always reminded about in that question is actually a US Supreme Court decision on pornography many years ago. And the opinion said, well, we heard this debate about what is pornography, what isn't pornography, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but the fact of the matter is I know it when I see it. And I think what we're saying here today about democracy, in a certain sense, is we know it when we start to lose it. Because in a lot of places, we take it for granted that we live in a democracy, democracy is thriving, the economy, when it is doing good, is doing good. We sort of take it for granted that we can exercise our democratic freedoms and do this. And, you know, I mean, how many years has it been since the Berlin Wall fell? And you have a whole new generation that wasn't even around then. They don't have any experience under Soviet rule. So they're functioning in a new liberal democracy, if you will. But when you have backsliding, when you have a backlash, when all of a sudden things start deteriorating for any number of these challenges that I mentioned earlier, whether it's the war on terrorism or the economic decline or any number of issues, when you start to lose it, that's when I think it becomes very clear what democracy really is, because when you lose it, it's that there's nothing there protecting the value. And when there's nothing there protecting the value, then that's when you're losing democracy, because then people don't have an attachment, people don't have a way of sustaining their own democracy, as particular as it may be.
On that note, I'd like to thank our guests. Thank you very much for coming. That's all we have time for. Until next time, goodbye and thank you. If we can collectively...
Thank you very much.